This module explains how to develop a procedure to identify high-risk areas. Places with recent or ongoing armed conflict bring potential risks to your supply chain, like instability, corruption, and human rights abuses. They're called conflict-affected and high-risk areas, CAHRAs. If you source from these high-risk areas, you'll need to conduct enhanced due diligence to manage the risks. But how do you know if an area is a conflict-affected and high-risk area? There's no internationally accepted list of high-risk areas. Instead, you'll define high-risk areas for yourself by evaluating them with your own criteria. This needs to be a formal written procedure. That way you can evaluate all your sourcing areas consistently and justify your decisions to your stakeholders. In the procedure, you'll define the criteria on which you base your decision, resources that you'll consider, and how often you'll review your evaluation. During an RMI audit, assessors will evaluate your written procedure and the records showing how you applied it to each source of material. You don't need to evaluate every country in the world, just the areas in your supply chain. First, you need to choose some criteria for defining a high-risk area. What sort of risks do you have to consider? At a minimum, your criteria for high-risk areas need to take into account the risks in your supply chain policy, based on the OECD guidance policy. Serious human rights abuses, support to non-state armed groups, support to public or private security forces, bribery and misrepresentation of the origin of minerals. Choose criteria that can cover all of these risks. 3 possible criteria you could use are armed conflict. If there's armed conflict, how severe and widespread is it? Governance. How well can the government maintain security and rule of law? Human rights. Are there reports of widespread human rights abuses? Once you define your criteria, select the resources you'll use to determine if an area is high risk, according to each of the criteria. Let's look at some publicly available resources and see how you could use them to make your determination. If you source from an area with ongoing armed conflict, there's a risk that supply chain actors could be directly or indirectly contributing to or benefiting non-state armed groups. Or, if public or private security forces are stationed nearby, they can extort money or minerals from supply chain actors, or commit human rights abuses. To evaluate the state of armed conflict, one good resource is the Heidelberg Conflict Barometer. It measures the intensity of conflict each year in countries and regions on a scale of 0 to 5, no conflict to war. Let's say you're looking at Heidelberg's analysis of the DR Congo. Based on the data, your colleague recommends that you consider the country to be high risk for armed conflict. Is this a reasonable evaluation? This is reasonable. Heidelberg rates the conflict at level 4, limited war. In this case, you might decide that any area rated 4 or higher on Heidelberg is high risk for armed conflict. This is a threshold. For each of the criteria, you need to define a threshold like this one, above which an area is considered high risk. In addition to Heidelberg, you could use these analytical sources, maps and tables, and information about specific regions. Countries without effective governance can expose your supply chain to risks like bribery, misrepresentation of minerals' origin, or money laundering. They're also higher risk for violence because of weak security. So governance is a useful criterion to evaluate. One resource you could use is the World Bank's Worldwide Governance Indicator, or WGI. A country ranked high in all areas is safe, stable, and free. For example, look at the WGI rating for Burundi. Would it be reasonable to determine that the country is high risk for lack of governance? The WGI ranks Burundi in the 10th percentile for governance, the lowest level. It would be reasonable to classify such a country as high risk for lack of governance. In your procedure, define the resources you'll use, such as the WGI, or the Fragile States Index, or Corruption Perceptions Index. Then define the threshold, for example, the 10th or 25th percentile of the WGI. Regions with recent armed conflict or weak governance are vulnerable to serious human rights abuses, so you might include the human rights situation as one of your criteria. Here, it's more difficult to find a readily available rating system. Instead, you could examine news and human rights reports to look for serious abuses, such as the ones covered in the OECD guidance. For example, let's say you're sourcing from Wa State in Myanmar. Read this part from the Human Rights Watch report and decide whether you'd consider your sourcing area to be high risk for human rights abuses. Your threshold for human rights abuses could evaluate whether they meet the OECD definition. You could also define whether your threshold includes abuses happening anywhere in the country or only within your sourcing area or mineral supply chain. Keep in mind, if you decide only to include your sourcing area, you need to consider the possibility of the human rights abuses spilling over into your area. Here are some resources you might use. Minds and Communities and Global Witness gather reports on human rights impacts in the mining industry. The United Nations and human rights organizations publish reports on the state of human rights in various countries. News media are also a valuable resource for identifying human rights abuses and bad actors in the supply chain. Check news sources like Reuters and Associated Press. Google Alerts can automatically scan for news reports in your region with your chosen keywords. The situation in an area can change, so it's important to regularly review your evaluations. Let's say you've been sourcing tin from Myanmar's Wa State as a low-risk sourcing area. You've been following the country on Google Alerts. Today, you get this Reuters report. When would you reevaluate the country's risk level? Define in your procedure how often you'll review your evaluation. For example, you might schedule reviews twice a year, or if your company is more risk-averse, you might review the status on an ongoing basis. Let's take a moment to review. When your smelter is assessed for conformance, you'll need to provide a formal written procedure showing how you identify high-risk areas. The procedure needs to define the criteria on which you base your decision, resources that you'll consider, and how often you'll review your evaluation. Your criteria needs to take into account the risks in your supply chain policy. 3 criteria you might consider are armed conflict, governance, and human rights. Then, define the resources you'll use to evaluate each of the criteria. Resources like Heidelberg and WGI rate the degree of armed conflict and governance in each country or area. Define thresholds beyond which an area is considered high risk. But human rights abuses are difficult to rate with a number. Instead, review reports from media, mining, and human rights organizations. You could define your threshold based on reports of serious human rights abuses happening in the country, sourcing area, or the mineral supply chain. Finally, define how often you'll review your evaluations of the risk level of each sourcing area. For example, twice a year or on an ongoing basis. By defining a procedure to identify high-risk areas, you can ensure that you consistently conduct the right level of due diligence to manage the risks everywhere you source.